bringing this pain upon himself. Can you imagine how Job must have felt? His heart was already broken. His body was in agony, and now his friends, the people who should have been comforting him, were telling him that it was his fault. Job had done nothing wrong, but no one seemed to believe him. Job's questions, wrestling with doubts and pain. As the days dragged on, Job's suffering grew more intense, each hour stretching into what felt like an eternity. The pain in his body was excruciating, but it was his heart, broken and bruised, that truly ached. Job had lost everything, his wealth, his family, his health, and in the midst of all this, his soul seemed to crack. His pain wasn't just a physical wound, it was something much deeper, a spiritual fracture that cut through his very being. Every question he asked seemed to echo louder than the last, each one reverberating through the emptiness of his heart. Why am I suffering? Job's voice quivered with desperation. What have I done to deserve this? These questions, once mere whispers, began to roar within him, relentlessly wearing down whatever strength he had left. Each day, another question, another stone in his path. His mind, once clear and sharp, was clouded with confusion. Job was searching for answers, but they slipped away, like sand through his fingers. It didn't make sense. He had lived a good life, a life rooted in integrity, generosity, and deep faith in God. He had always believed that if you followed God's ways, life would go well. So, why now? Why this? Why had everything that he had worked so hard for, everything that had been a gift from God, been taken away? Job's life had once been a testimony of blessing and favor. He had been the epitome of righteousness, known for his fairness, his commitment to justice, and his care for the needy. He had honored God with his actions, lived generously, and treated others with kindness. But now, everything was gone. His wealth had evaporated, his children were dead, and his body was ravaged by disease. In his moments of deepest agony, Job couldn't help but question why God had allowed all of this to happen to him. His world had been shaken to its core, and he felt as though the very foundation of his existence was crumbling beneath his feet. "Why is this happening?" Job cried out, his voice thick with sorrow. "Why me? Why now? What did I do to deserve this?" It was a question many of us ask when life doesn't seem fair. We all face moments when we feel abandoned by the world, moments when we question why we must endure such heartache. Job's story speaks to that universal human experience, the painful wrestling with doubt, confusion, and the search for meaning in the midst of suffering. When everything is stripped away, we are left with the most basic and important question: why? Perhaps you've faced your own moments of questioning. Maybe you've been hit with a loss that took your breath away, or a trial that tested every ounce of your patience and strength. Maybe you've asked, why me? Or, why now? When life feels upside down, it's easy to feel lost, as if the world around you doesn't make sense anymore. And like Job, we often search for the reasons behind our pain. It's natural to want to know why bad things happen to good people, and to struggle with the tension between the goodness of God and the suffering we face. But here's the surprising part of Job's story. Despite his desperate questions, despite the overwhelming confusion, Job never turned away from God. His cries of anguish weren't directed at the void. They were aimed squarely at the one who had allowed this pain to enter his life. Job, in his grief, didn't shut God out. He cried out to God. His suffering led him to a raw and honest place where his pain, confusion, and frustration could be laid bare before the Creator. In the midst of his questions, Job kept reaching for God. His faith wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a faith that allowed him to bring his doubts, his anger, and his sorrow into the presence of God. Job's questions were big, really big, but they were the questions that often surface in moments of suffering. These are the questions that many of us wrestle with when we face hardship. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God allow such pain in the lives of those who try to live right? Job's story teaches us that it's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to bring our doubts and struggles to God. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting in God, even when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are. Job's willingness to ask these tough questions, his openness with God in the midst of suffering, reminds us that God welcomes our honest hearts. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to have it all figured out. God knows we are human. He knows our hearts. And He invites us to bring our whole selves to Him. He doesn't expect us to pretend we have all the answers, or that we don't feel pain. Job's story shows us that faith doesn't require us to be free from doubt. It's about continuing to trust in God, even when life doesn't make sense. In our own lives, we can learn from Job's example. It's okay to be honest with God about our pain, our doubts, and our questions. Sometimes, just being real with God, expressing our feelings and asking our hard questions, is a step toward healing. Job's cries weren't the end of his journey. They were the beginning of a deeper relationship with God. His willingness to seek God, even in his confusion, opened the door to a new phase of his journey, a phase where he would gain a deeper understanding of who God is, even in the midst of his suffering. So, when life brings you to your knees, when the weight of the world feels unbearable, remember Job. You can ask the hard questions, express your doubts, and still hold on to God. He is there, listening to every cry, every question, and every tear. You are not alone in your suffering. Even when it feels like the world is indifferent, God is near. He understands your pain, and He is with you in the midst of it. Have you ever been in a situation where you asked, why? Have you ever faced a challenge that made you feel completely lost and broken? Like Job, you can share those feelings with God. You can pour out your heart to Him, knowing that He sees you and cares deeply about your struggles. In those moments of pain, when the answers seem far away, trust that God is listening and that He is working in ways you cannot see. Elihu speaks a fresh perspective on suffering. As Job wrestled with his pain in the silence of God, something unexpected happened. A young man named Elihu, who had been quietly observing the conversations between Job and his friends, stood up to speak. Until now, the dialogue had been dominated by Job's friends, who had offered their own explanations for his suffering, accusations that Job was being punished for some hidden sin. But Elihu was different. He had watched in silence, waiting for the right moment to speak. Now, with a sense of urgency, he stepped forward and offered Job something new, a fresh perspective. Unlike the others, Elihu didn't accuse Job of wrongdoing. He didn't try to assign blame. Instead, he spoke with a wisdom that was both bold and compassionate. He acknowledged Job's pain and the depth of his suffering, but he also offered a new way of looking at the situation. Elihu's words were like a breath of fresh air in the midst of the suffocating despair Job had been feeling. He told Job, God's ways are higher than our ways, and sometimes suffering is a process, an opportunity for growth. This wasn't the kind of answer Job had been seeking, but it was a different kind of truth, one that Job hadn't considered. Elihu didn't dismiss Job's pain, or belittle his suffering. He simply offered a new way of thinking about it. That suffering, while incredibly painful, could also serve a higher purpose. Sometimes, the difficulties we face are not a punishment. They are a part of a process that God uses to refine us, to shape us, and to make us stronger. This perspective was not about minimizing Job's pain, but about expanding his understanding of God's greater plan. For Job, Elihu's words were a turning point. After listening to his friends accuse him, and struggling to find answers on his own, here was someone offering a new perspective. One that helped Job see that his suffering might have a deeper purpose. Perhaps it wasn't just something to endure. It could be something that would draw him closer to God. Something that would refine his character and deepen his faith. Job hadn't considered that his pain could be part of a larger process. Something that could shape his future and bring him closer to the heart of God. Elihu's wisdom didn't offer all the answers, but it gave Job a new framework through which to view his suffering. It helped him like, comment, subscribe, share. Stay connected for part 3. Thanks for watching. God bless you,